Welcome to Pasa, HSIs, a podcast dedicated to everything Hispanic serving institutions. I'm your host, Dr. Gina Ann Garcia, bringing you the news on what's happening in HSIs. Join us as we explore the history and evolution of HSIs, culturally relevant and liberatory practices, current and emerging research with HSIs, and the policies that shape servingness. Saludos, HSI familia, and welcome to the first episode of Season 2 of ¿Qué pasa, HSIs? I can't thank you enough for the love and support for the podcast. Mil gracias. We have been downloaded over 5,000 times and continue to gain followers who are trying to figure out how to enact and research servingness. The podcast is for HSI practitioners and scholars, and I am honored to deliver this HSI knowledge through this platform. Many of you have expressed admiration for the conversations that are had on the podcast as we come at you real. Big shout out to Alan A.C. Williams for all the behind the scenes production work. He does all the editing, but much of the content is raw and uncut. I hope you all can appreciate that this is grassroots efforts. I also want to shout out Estefania Toledo for promoting the show on our social media platforms. Be sure to follow us on @QuePasaHSIs. In this episode, I talked to Dr. Blanca E. Vega, Assistant Professor of Higher Education at Montclair State University, about a variety of important topics for HSIs to consider, including perceptions of racial conflict in HSIs, complicating Latinidad in HSIs, and supporting undocumented students in HSIs. Dr. Vega's scholarship broadly focuses on the role of higher education and student affairs administrators in building more equitable environments and how racism impacts higher education experiences and success, not just for students, but also for administrators and faculty. She also studies perceptions of racial conflict, the role of racialized ideologies in racial conflict, and policies related to racial conflict, as well as leadership and policy making concerning undocumented students, Latinidad in higher education, and HSIs as racialized organizations. Born and raised in New York City, Dr. Vega is the daughter of Ecuadorian immigrants. She earned an EDD from the Higher Ed and Post-Secondary Education program at Teachers College, Columbia University. Prior to becoming a professor, she worked in various administrative positions within higher education, spanning over 16 years, including financial aid counseling and directing New York State opportunity programs, such as the Liberty Partnerships Program, LPP, and the Higher Education Opportunity Program, HEOP. Dr. Vega earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in anthropology from Brandeis University and a Master of Arts in Higher Education at New York University. I have known Dr. Vega for many years since we were doctoral students attending the Association for the Study of Higher Education's annual conference. I'll never forget the feeling of admiration and respect that I had when I first met her, as she's a brilliant and powerful force. I have followed her journey into the professoriate, and I am honored to be her friend, colleague, and mentor. I served as a guest editor for her article in AERA Open entitled Hispanic Serving Institutions as Racialized Organizations, Elevating Intersectional Consciousness to Reframe the H in HSIs, which is available in the show notes. You can follow her on social media to learn more about her research and about the topics we explore in this episode. All righty then, let's go ahead and get into the show. Doctora Vega, thank you for taking the time to be here today on ¿Qué pasa, HSIs, where we talk about all things HSIs. But before we get into talking about HSIs, we like to talk about you and hear a little bit about you. So let's start first. If you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and your educational journey and how you came to be who you are today.
Thank you so much for having me on your podcast. It's a real honor. And I'm also really grateful, to have this opportunity to speak with you about HSIs and what I've learned, my journey in higher ed. And I should say that my origin story in higher ed really begins in 1968. And I promise this isn't going to be a long story, but I feel like if I don't mention this, it's just, it would just be negating a big part of my story. But my father, his name is Miguel Vega. He immigrated from Ecuador in 1968. He immigrated from Ecuador to New York City. About a few weeks after his arrival, he asked a friend to help him, navigate the train system. And if anybody's been to New York, it takes a while to learn the train system, like the numbers, the letters, where is it going. And so, his friend offered to teach him, but at some point they lost each other. And so my father ended up in Manhattan, somewhere in Manhattan on the one train. And he decided it was getting late, he said, and he decided to get off, right? On 110th Street on the one train. So that's by like Columbia University. Columbia University is on 116th Street and Broadway. So, it was nighttime. So he had to find lodging. He found something. And then probably he said the next morning he did what he usually does, which is walk around to see where he's at. And as he was walking north, he found a hospital, St. Luke's Roosevelt Hospital, where I ended up being born. And then a few blocks down from that was Columbia University. And he said, then that this is a place where he wanted to stay. Most Ecuadorians live in Queens, New York. In fact, a lot of Ecuadorian researchers and writers call Queens the third largest city of Ecuador after Quito and Guayaquil. But he ended up in Manhattan because he saw these two wonderful institutions, right? And he knew that Columbia University, that living that close to Columbia University would inspire us, his children, to go to college, right? Like, I don't know how my father, like when I tell you that my dad grew up on a farm in Ecuador, and at 9 years old, left that farm to work, right? And to have that kind of thinking, like, and I don't know if anybody knows what New York was like in the 60s and 70s and 80s, but it was not fun, right? But he was like, no, I'm going to stay here. I'm going to learn to, find a job at the hospital, which he did as a maintenance worker and a boiler room operator. And he took English classes at Columbia. So, for us and in New York, that was like the only green spot besides Central Park and Riverside Park, which we were sandwiched between. So my dad thought that it was, and it wasn't for him. He was like, I can't take my girls to the parks all the time. It looked safe at Columbia because they have security guards and all of that. So he took us there all the time. And if you know the image of Columbia, there's like that iconic image of the steps and the alma mater. But he would sit us down there and he would talk to us about, like, I couldn't go to college, but all of you can come here. And, of course, that led me to desiring, a place, right, in higher ed. But as I was growing up on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, back then it was called West Harlem, but they moved that down because of gentrification. What I noticed was that, I didn't look like the kids who went to Columbia, right? So we would go to the diners, we would go to the campus, and I started noticing that the white kids were wearing the Columbia sweatshirts, and the kids who looked like me or looked like my dad were wearing maintenance uniforms, right? That there's like the green maintenance uniform. I have a picture of my dad in it from a long time ago. And and it just started, and this was when I was little, like this was like 6, 7, 8 years old. I was starting to notice these differences, like, and when my friends, parents, they were working at the hospital, working at Columbia, but none of us actually attended Columbia, right? We didn't know anybody who attended Columbia. And so that's really when my ideas of stratification, of racial stratification, of racialization really started for me. Was just, the idea of that resources were attached to what I looked like. I wasn't wearing, and people who I knew were not wearing, the Columbia sweatshirts. We were wearing the green uniforms. We were wearing, our parents' like green maintenance uniforms. And being Ecuadorian, in New York in the 70s and 80s also meant that I was the only one, right? Like, like I had just said, in Ecuadorians typically lived and resided in Queens, which is another borough of New York, not in Manhattan. And my father would say that, that back in the day, you would be lucky if you ran into an Ecuadorian once every 3 months, right? Like he was like, and we all knew each other. Like my father made sure it was his like thing to like get to know who were the other Ecuadorians in the community. So we never saw the Ecuadorian flag raised. We never heard of a parade. We didn't hear our music blasting. We had maybe one show on Saturday mornings that were blasted in Radio Wado, which is like the Spanish language station. And my family was committed. We were listening to Radio Wado on Saturday mornings to listen to our Ecuadorian music, right? But it was only in my little 2-bedroom apartment, on 108th Street in Amsterdam that I even encountered Ecuadorianness, right? Outside of my neighborhood and in the Columbia University neighborhood, I really was, I lived in an Afro-Latino, what we would call Afro-Latino neighborhood today. The neighborhood was predominantly Black, Black Latinos, Dominicans, Haitians. I didn't even grow up with Puerto Rican people, right? Where we lived was heavily Dominican. And so I, grew up in a very interesting, I think, Latino experience where, I knew I was not Black, but I also knew that I was a cousin, right? And that I was family. And so whenever people ask me about like, why am I so committed to understanding, to being in community with Black people, I'm always like, but how can I not be? That's family. Like, like why would I even be asked such a question? Because yeah, like it and also my upbringing, I was never identified even within my family, as a white Latina, right? I was immediately identified by family members as what we would call sambita, right? And so in English, and in US history, that has a particular negative history, right? um but what I didn't understand and know, and this is somewhat reflected in the paper that we wrote for for ARA Open for your special issue, was that the Sambo Nation, was really began in the 1500s, from marooned enslaved Africans who rebelled, right, against, their slave masters, right? And they built a society of Afro-Indigenous people, right? It was then used against people, right, as a way to insult Ecuadorians, right? And so that history was also very squashed because, as all histories are of, rebellious African enslaved people, right? That story gets lost. That story gets denied. That story gets maligned. Um, and certainly that was the way that it was used against me as a little girl. When somebody was calling me Sambita, it wasn't necessarily the most positive thing, but it was to immediately identify that I was not white. I wasn't Black, but she's not white, right? And
Right,
that's how
right.
it was. That's how it was really like put together. My racialization, my growing up in higher ed, my growing up Ecuadorian in higher ed, really began those ideas, those thoughts.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for sharing that story. It's a beautiful story that I've never heard. I love learning about people in this podcast. And for also, getting into what a lot of your scholarship is about complicating what we know about Latinidad and about what it means to be Hispanic, Latino, Latinx in this country, right? Because I would assume that you probably for most of your life, because you're from New York and a Latina, people probably thought you were Puerto Rican or Dominican, right? Like there's not a lot of complication. We see very monolithically, unfortunately. So I love that you're complicating what that means for us and sharing your story, through your story. So I love the idea about like that you immediately could see. I don't love it, but that you were so critical. You could immediately see that like white people wear Columbia sweatshirts and my people wear the maintenance, stuff. So tell us a little bit more about college then. How did you come to know that you could go to college? Tell us about your college journey and how you actually wound up now a professor even.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I still think, I'm like 2 generations away from poverty, 1 generation away from being 150% below the poverty level, right? Which is why I was able to access college access and retention programs like Talent Search, Upward Bound, um, and 2 generations from being illiterate. I mean, when I think about, like how crazy that is, that the decision that my father made, to come to the United States in 1968, and the decision that my mother, who never wanted to come to the United States, made to follow him in 1971, was something that I think about a lot. And I think it really influenced, I really made my parents' goals of going to Columbia kind of part of my dream. I obviously didn't make it to Columbia as an undergrad, which devastated me. So on the day that I was rejected from Columbia University, I got an acceptance to Brandeis University, which is a predominantly white Jewish institution. I shouldn't say it was Jewish. So it was founded by Jewish scholars and people, because Jewish people were denied from admissions from Columbia, from Harvard, etc. So Brandeis University established the university in 1948. I Because I went to high school, and for those who are from New York, I went to Brooklyn Tech High School, which is at the time was one of the 3 specialized science high schools in New York City. I was always identified as a smart kid, even when I was in elementary school. So I was pushed to do a lot of the sciences. The sciences were really my thing. I was did really well in science and math. I went to Brooklyn Tech. I was immediately shuffled into this program called the Gateway Program, which out of 1,000 freshman students, 50 students were selected to be part of a pre-med program. So like as soon as I got to Brooklyn Tech, I was taking biology, chemistry, to the point where I was taking AP Bio, AP Chemistry, AP Physics. I didn't take AP Humanities. It was all a really heavy science background. So I was, determined I'm going to become, a doctor, like a medical doctor. So I applied to Brandeis University because I was told they give you great financial aid and they're very good for the sciences. So I made it part of my list. But so I was heartbroken when Columbia denied me. I could not even walk to 116th Street anymore.
Oh no.
I always say that's my official first heartbreak. But my counselors at in my talent search and Upward Bound program, I'll never forget Miss Marcia. She sat me down and she was like, "So where are you going to go next year?" And I said to her, I was like, "I don't know, but I'm not going anywhere. I'm not doing this anymore." And she was like, and I said to her, I'm like, "If it's not Columbia, I don't know if I want to go to Brandeis. Like, I just really don't know." And she was like, "God dreams a bigger dream for you." And she was like, "And you don't know if Columbia is going to be in your future." And I was like, "How?" Because at the time I only knew bachelor's degree. That was it. That's it. That's my life. Like, what else do I do? Right. Like, I had no idea. I was in those programs, but it wasn't like we knew about a master's degree. We knew about like a doctorate. Right. So anyway, I was like, you know what? Let me go to Brandeis University. They're going to pay for most of my my tuition. It's away. It'll be my time to get away from New York, maybe learn something new. Horrible, hated it. When I attended Brandeis University, race, ethnicity, and class was so salient. Like, I was immediately, like, if there's any time that, like, you go to a place like Brandeis, like, people definitely know you're not white, right? We were all lumped in the same boat. Like, we were all the faces of the bottom of that well. And, it was, they didn't even know what Latino was. Like, when I would say, so I will say that when I first got to Brandeis, it was in 1994, Hispanic and Latino were not like terms that we used very much. like in my neighborhood, you were Dominican, you were Puerto Rican, you were Ecuadorian, you were all of you were Haitian, but there was nothing like, oh, we're Latino, we're Hispanic, right? It was when we got to Brandeis that we were like, oh shit, we're in the same boat together. Like, what do we call ourselves, right? And so when I started saying, when I started saying I'm Ecuadorian, people were like, what the hell is that? Even the Latino folks.
Mm-hmm.
And when I said I was Latina or Hispanic, the white folks were like, what is that? And the folks who did know were like, oh, Rosie Perez. So then I was called Rosie Perez on campus. Yes, it was really something, because I struggled with between hating being called Rosie Perez and desiring, like, not wanting to hate her at the same time, because I knew what they were trying to do by calling me that. They were not saying it was a positive thing. They were saying I had a funny accent. They were saying that I looked different. They were saying all of these things, but I fought every day to make it a positive for me, to the point where every time somebody said something like, oh, you're here on affirmative action, I was like, yes, I am. And, every time somebody would say something that they meant to hurt me with, I was just like, yep. And what are you going to do about it? So I had no other way in college to really, who gave us that kind of education, right? To understand Latinidad, to understand racialization. It was just, I was unable to articulate those experiences, let alone how to address them. So I wanted to fight, like, every day. I wanted to fight, right? So out the window went my science background. Out the window, I was, like, these were classes. I had used the same textbooks that I used in my high school classes. I used in those science classes, but I failed them. I was just not into it anymore. My brain was distracted. I was like, where the hell am I? Why is this happening? Right? It just, like, classes that should have been familiar were foggy all of a sudden. And my focus was on why I was being called Rosie Perez, why the cross on my neck that my mom gave me a scapulary to protect me, why that cross was something that made other people feel uncomfortable on that campus. And even amongst, the Latino folks, like, they didn't understand why I was so angry, right? Even when people were like, yo, you're angry. I'm like, yes, I am. You should be too. Like, I really, like, had to learn to develop those, that arsenal of responses, sort of what Daniel Solorzano calls, right, in terms of microaggressions. But I developed that arsenal, but I didn't have a way to really speak on it, like describe my experiences. Until, like, my junior year, right? So my junior year in college, it was 1997. I'll never forget. There was an administrator. He was assistant dean of student life, Nathaniel Mays, Dr. Nathaniel Mays, and he's walking around the cafeteria, and I'm, like, sitting there with my friends, and my friends and I are talking about the racism we were experiencing at Brandeis, and he just kind of, like, is like over us, and he's like, so what are we going to do about this? He said, what are we going to do about this? He didn't say, what are you going to do about this, like other administrators were saying. He was saying, what are we going to do about this? And I, with my big mouth, was like, nothing, because nobody's paying me. He said, well, what if I told you? He's like, what if I told you that you can get paid to do some of this work? They were looking for somebody to run their orientation program for students of color. So at the time, we had a huge orientation program. There were 9 students who were coordinating different parts, and they couldn't find somebody to run the program for students of color. That program doesn't exist anymore. We're trying to bring it back. They keep calling us to, like, help out with their stuff at Brandeis. But I was like, no, I'm not doing it. I'm not going to hang out at the Brandeis University campus for another, like, I'm not doing it. But he kept talking to me about it. And I was like, you know what? Why not? Let's try it. Around the same time, I was having fights with the Latino organization, the student organization named Ahora. They were having, their, what I call celebratory functions, right? There was a lot of parties. It was a lot of like, let's dance salsa, let's eat salsa kind of parties, right? And I was like, talked to Dr. Nathaniel Mays and was like, can you help me with trying to figure this out? Because I don't like the activities they're doing. He was like, well, then maybe you should become president. I was like, hell no, I'm not going to become president of that organization. I'm not doing it. Like, that's embarrassing. Hell no, I'm not doing it. I'm not doing it. He was like, well, then there's no other way. If you want it, because I was like, well, maybe we could do something like Hispanic Heritage Month, which was very new at the time. And Brandeis never had something like that. And I was like, and then we could do discussions and panels. He was like, well, then you're going to have to be president because it's going to look crazy. You doing Hispanic Heritage Month over there and them doing Latino student organization stuff over here. So I brought the idea. I was like, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to bring the idea back to Ahora, the student organization. They said no. So I got up and I was like, well, then I'm going to do Hispanic Heritage Month somewhere else. And I had students who came after me and they were like, we want to do that idea too. And so they put me on the ballot. I became president of the Latino student organization. And that summer, I knew that I needed the resources that I was going to get from the orientation program to now share that with this first Latino Heritage Month. That again was my first real experience with resource deprivation and the way that resources are allocated along the lines of race, right? Which I didn't know at the time, right? In 1997 was Eduardo Bonilla Silva's seminal piece on racialized social systems. So his theory of racialized social systems brought together these ideas of how we allocate resources along the lines of race. I had no idea that this piece was being written. I was a junior in college, but here I was really like grappling with these things. Like I was literally bringing whatever resources I found and that I received, training, all of that into, from orientation, because they were very well funded, very well resourced, very well planned, to a student organization that was neglected, that was only focusing on parties at the time. And that we only, I had to fight for a budget that was, I believe, $2,000 at the time to run a whole month, right, of activities. I was like, I got to do this, but it was really, it was just interesting that I, in those moments, realized that what I wanted to do was continue my work around race, but also support students who look like me, who were like me, who came from environments like I did, to survive places like Brandeis University. I did not want to leave those students alone. And that really became my, where I really nurtured some of those ideas of wanting to be in higher ed, but not knowing that I could get a master's degree, not knowing that I could get a doctorate. That didn't really come along until, I think 2002. So I graduated in 1998 from Brandeis. And in 2002, I entered into a master's program at NYU in higher ed. And there they were like, you need more than 2 years. You should really enter a doctoral program. And that's how it all began.
Yeah. You were always being critical of things, right? And very observant. Obviously, you're like, no, I see what it is.
Right.
I can see what's going on here. As I listen to your story, I'm like, the researcher in me, I'm like coding everything,
Yep.
like the pre-college experiences. And then you got to campus and then it was like this awakening, right? Of like, oh my gosh, this place is terrible. And then part of me, the HSI scholar in me wants you to tell me a story about how you went to an HSI and it was amazing. But I already know you're not going to tell me that story, but we'll get to that because, we know HSIs are not those spaces yet. But when I hear your story, I'm like, that's what I dream about, right? Is like when that HSIs will make it so nobody ever experiences that again, right? Exactly what you said, right? Which many of us have experienced, right? That feeling of like, this is not it. This is not what I imagined it was going to be. So let's hear about your servingness story. I call it your servingness journey, right? Like, how did you come to understand what an HSI was? Because you very clearly came to understand what it was like to be in a predominantly white space, particularly as a person of color. How did you learn about HSIs and how did that come into your consciousness?
You know, that is also, for me, it was a relatively new concept until about maybe 2006, 2007. Um, I was a doctoral student for sure, and I was also working in a predominantly white liberal arts college in New York. But I worked within that college, which at one point actually had over 43% students of color. This was before I got there. So the history of that institution was that it did, it did serve the community. And I remember like my cousins going there to take art classes, for example, because it was heavy, heavily focused on theater, dance, arts. Um, so when I was there, I was director of a college access and retention program called HEOP, the Higher Education Opportunity Program. And the majority of the students who were in that program were Latinx, right? And they were folks who were from similar backgrounds that I came from, low income. A lot of the students that I worked with were Dominican. And so our program was highlighted often as a program that served Latino students, and that very proudly served Latino students because their director was Latino, right? And so, you know, it was something that I was like, kind of like what you were saying, what would that kind of institution look like? I already knew what a program like that could look like because we did it. We were doing it. We did it for 8 years, right? We were this program that served the majority Black and Latino students, in a predominantly white institution. So that's really the idea of spaces where that came from for me. I do a lot of work around Black spaces today in minority serving institutions and Hispanic serving institutions. But this idea of like what that might look like, right? For, what would it look like for Latino students to be happy, to be successful at any institution, was really driven there. And then, that was until 2014. And then I applied for, I finished my doctoral program in 2015 at Teachers College, Columbia University. And then in 2016, I was 9 months pregnant, called into a job talk at Montclair State University. And fun fact, I never made it to that job talk because Miguel decided he wanted to come to my job talk. So, so on the day of my job talk, I had to go to the hospital and deliver him early because, because he was ready. So they waited for, I think I was about 2 or 3 weeks postpartum. I finally did the job talk. And one of the questions, and it was something that they were very proud of, in 2016, Montclair State University was recently designated a Hispanic serving institution, and I had read some of your work at that point. I knew some of the work that you were trying to do when, in 2016, 2015. And, but I didn't, again, like I was very not knowledgeable, not many of us were, right? It was quite a time because, there were all these institutions that were like, yeah, we just became a Hispanic serving institution. And then it was like, yeah, where are all the Latinos? Like, right? So I was like, so they specifically asked me a question about my dissertation research, where I did, my research at a predominantly white institution and a minority serving institution that was also a Hispanic serving institution. And so they were really interested in what I found in terms of racial conflict, right, at this Hispanic serving institution. And what I talked about, was that, students perceived, Black students, Black faculty, Black administrators really perceived the structural forms of racial conflict, unlike at the predominantly white institution where they were encountering more interpersonal forms of conflict. So interpersonal forms of conflict, I mean, microaggressions, hate speech, hate crimes. Those are interpersonal. At the minority serving institution, at the Hispanic serving institution, they were experiencing more structural forms, right? They were experiencing, encounters with the police. Why was there such a police presence on this campus versus, the white institution that was, a few blocks away or something. They were experiencing lack of Black faculty, right? Black faculty they were leaving. Their Black Studies department at the time was not funded, and so it was defunct, and a student center was being taken away at the time that primarily served Black students. So all of that was like this resource deprivation, right? It wasn't just so we talk about a lot about allocating resources when it comes to racialization and processes, right? But we don't talk about deprivation, which I think we need to start talking about when it comes to not just Hispanic serving institutions, but all institutions. How are we depriving the resources? Because what the students and the other respondents did not know at the time, which I, ended up documenting, was that for the last 7 years, that was between maybe 2006 and 2015, 2013, 2015 was when I did the research. Their Black student population had dwindled about 10%, right? And their Latino and Asian student population was fastly increasing. Like it was just increasing during that time, right? So they were proudly calling themselves a minority serving institution, proudly calling themselves a Hispanic serving institution, but their Black student population was dwindling. But their Black Studies department had no money, but their Black Student Center was being taken away. And so these students were feeling like, we can't, what's next, right? Was what one of my respondents said was, what's next? I'm supposed to be here. I came to this institution because I thought they would take care of me, because they said they were a minority serving institution, because they said they were a Hispanic serving institution. Then I come here and the Black students are being neglected. So when are we going to talk about serving this amongst Black students at Hispanic serving institutions, right?
Yep, absolutely.
And that's, again, it's something that I was grateful that Montclair State decided, to offer me a job, because when I have said that at other institutions, they were like, yeah, peace.
They're like, we see what's going to happen.
Right.
If she comes.
Well, because I wasn't necessarily like, oh, we got to do this for the Latino folks.
No.
Institution. I was just like, but have you taken some notes on what's going on with your Black student population? Because just because we're a Hispanic serving institution doesn't mean that there's harmony here, right? Mm-hmm. And it's not to say they're not doing some of the work, right? It's just saying that we need to do a little bit more. And this is what the paper sort of brings about, is sort of this intersectionality to organizations in a way that in a way that's much different than at predominantly white institutions.
Absolutely. Oh, I have so many questions. Ooh, this is where it starts to get fun when we talking the HSI stuff. The idea of like us not talking about Black students at HSIs, that's huge. And people are concerned about that. When I, give talks or I work with HSIs, I often get that question, and often from Black people are like, what does this mean for us? Right? Like if we are doing this HSI thing, I'm all for it. Right. And there's often this like, I'm for it. I'm for solidarity. I'm for us doing this work collectively. But usually there's this feeling that everybody else isn't for it. Right. And particularly that nobody wants to include Black people in those sort of conversations. Right. Despite the fact that Black folks generally include other folks. And so the race-based conflict, stream of your research, I'm fascinated, because I think that we need to learn more about that. So for the listeners that are having those exact conversations on their campus, the HSI, tell us a little bit more about some of your findings around race-based conflict in minority serving spaces, and like what can we learn from what you learned, and or how do we address that race-based conflict, because it is real in HSIs.
Yeah. So, just to give you a little bit of background, I originally grounded my work on organizational conflict theory, right? And sort of those disagreements, policy and practice disagreements that exist within institutions that cause discord, whether individually, so like within myself, like am I crazy? Am I thinking that, am I thinking too much into this? The interpersonal, which is now, like the intergroup, right, stuff, right? The so the microaggressions, the hate speech, the intergroup conflicts that could exist. What my paper in Teachers College Record shows, in terms of the administrators, against students, right? So students and administrators being these groups that now are in conflict, that's race-based. And so I looked at those levels, and for the ARA open paper, really looked at how, what would this look like in racialized organizations. So race-based organizational conflicts are really those that discord, those policy disagreements, those practices that are racialized that cause conflict, right, within an organization. So a huge example, which I think you've been trying to solve forever, right, is this idea of how do we call ourselves Hispanic serving when we're not serving, right? That's an example of an organizational process conflict, right? That is race-based, that is ethnicity-based, that we haven't been able to necessarily resolve yet, right? Again, another one that I've been kind of hammering in my work has been this idea of resource deprivation. So, which populations within these institutions, within Hispanic serving institutions, most recently in my work, which populations are, being deprived of resources, not just that they're not being allocated, but literally deprived, right? Like, are the Black student population dwindling? Do we not have Black professors? Are we choosing the Latino professors over the Black professors? If so, why? Are we ignoring the Afro-Latino students and sort of elevating their Latinidad, but not offering them, culturally relevant pedagogy, right? It's so those are conflicts. Those are where I'm talking about the organizational conflicts, right? That we would normally just kind of say, oh, those are organizational conflicts, right? Like, but that they produce racialized outcomes, right? That I think, again, that I'm trying to really push for in my articles, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, maybe, because it's hard, I think, for folks to think about racial conflict in terms of organizations. A lot of us have been focusing on, again, the racial microaggressions. We've been focusing on, hate crimes, hate speech, and those are important aspects. Those are, that's conflict as well. But what about the organizations, right? What about our society? Can we learn, from these conflicts that would inform those microaggressions, right? That would continue to maintain that hate speech, right? One of those organizational conflicts that I think, is race-based, is the First Amendment, the protection of freedom of, of speech, even when it hurts, students of color. That's a huge organizational conflict that we have to resolve, and that we can't resolve legally. Like Liliana Garces wrote in 2021 a paper about this, about how hate speech, is hard for administrators to handle and to address because of this First Amendment. That's a type of organizational conflict that is race-based, but that most people wouldn't look at it as such. That is race-based because they don't study the racialized outcomes, which I think more people are starting to do, but they're not naming it as a conflict. They're not naming it as an organizational conflict that produces racialized outcomes. And I think that's the piece that a lot of theories around racialized social systems, big up to, to Eduardo Bonilla Silva, racialized organizations, shout out to Victor Ray, for doing that work. But a lot of this work is missing how to study conflict. And that's what I'm trying to do. And I think it's really, for me, it's been helpful to do this in the HSI setting, because it felt, it was like we see the microaggressions and, the hate speech and the hate crimes. We see the interpersonal types of conflict at historically white institutions so clearly. But if we look at the Hispanic serving institutions, those are the institutions that really can, have less of those types of incidents, but more of the structural kind. And that's something that I think that needs more work.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for explaining that. Because I think when you say conflict, like it's a like I know my brain immediately goes to like interpersonal conflict, right? Between people. But what you're talking about is like, no, these like larger tensions within the organization that are racialized, right? Like, and that we often, and that those are those things people have trouble putting their finger on, right? They're like, I can't feel it. I don't fully understand what you're talking about, right? Which I'm
You
sure
know,
is what you found.
yeah, and you know who does a really good job at doing that is Whitney Pirtle, a sociologist.
Right.
But she is, but she
UC Merced. No, yeah,
yes,
UC Merced.
yes, she does a wonderful job talking about, you know, how anti-Blackness pervades Hispanic serving institutions, how those processes, how ideologies really help inform those interpersonal relationships, right? In the article that I wrote in 2019 really talks about the resource deprivation, and I don't talk about ideologies in that piece, but I really dig into some of the organizational processes. But then she brings in the ideologies, how those ideologies inform conflict, right? And how they maintain conflict between students and administrators at HSIs, which is how that AERA opened, like that. You know, it was just like, wait, this is what we're experiencing at these HSIs as Latino researchers and students, my co-authors and I, Roman Liera and Mildred Boveda, how we were thinking about this paper, because we were like, this goes beyond the processes, but we were, like, this is really about ideologies, how we were all experiencing a form of anti-Blackness, but it wasn't specifically anti-Blackness, right? It was a derivative of it. That was the blancamiento process. That was the mestizaje process. That's what we were naming as part of this group of anti-Black ideologies that had been informing us for centuries, right? It's in our blood memory at this point. It's the way that societies have, created bodies that look like mine, right? That literally, like, light skin, have some other features, that are not white, but they literally create, like, when you think about the ways that we, as our bodies, have been informed by blancamiento, that our bodies and our societies have been informed by mestizaje, right? That, at some point you're like, I get that it was an act of survival too, but we are literally the embodiment of these ideologies that we have to fight every day against. Otherwise, we become subsumed by these ideologies, right? Which is where we were trying to kind of say, this is the danger of mestizaje. It makes us all go back to that melting pot, salad bowl type of ideology. This is the danger of blancamiento. It will literally create a new body to maintain the white supremacist societies that existed in Latin America. And we're using Hispanic serving institutions to preserve those ideologies. So how do we disrupt that? Right? First, we have to name it. We have to name it, right? We can't just call it anti-Black. We have to call it what it was, in these Latin American societies, right? There's specific type of anti-Blackness. There's blancamiento and there's mestizaje that we have in our DNA.
Right. Yeah, for sure.
So if it's in our DNA, how can it not be in the DNA of HSIs?
Yeah, it absolutely is. And I think that's what the article really, really gets at. I'll go ahead and plug the name now for the listeners, and we'll drop it in the show notes. The Hispanic Serving Institutions as Racialized Organizations, Elevating Intersectional Consciousness to Reframe the H in HSI, which was, as you have mentioned, published in our AERA Open special topic collection. So tell us a little bit, like, as you said, we can't really disrupt it until we name it, right? And you and your co-authors, you name it very beautifully through your own testimonials, right? Like, very much like, tell us your stories. You tell us, this is our stories, and then attach it to a racialized organization theory, right? Victor Ray's organizational theory, which was really powerful, by the way. I was just like I loved it, right? That you're like, these are our stories and here's how we're going to talk to it at this organizational level. So that's what, anyone who's listening that like they're at that HSI that's trying to figure out, how do I be better? How do I disrupt the mestizaje mentality, the mestizaje that's in the DNA or the blanqueamiento? How do we disrupt that? So what do we learn from it, and what do we do in practice with your article?
Yeah, that's something that I think we have to also do more work on, is how do we now bring these ideologies to the ground, right?
Mm-hmm.
What does, like you said, look like in practice? And that part was actually difficult, I think, for us to really hone in, figure out. And we started thinking about the ways that theories of intersectionality really help us disrupt some of this pan-ethnic effects, right? So the effects of pan-ethnicity, which is to have, some of the same people at the table, but calling it diverse because, they happen to be called Hispanic, right? Which then it's kind of like what I call the mestizaje 2.0, right? We have this new understanding, or it's kind of easy to digest this diversity because they're Latino, and so therefore they should know better. And it's fine, right? Like, we got this racial harmony now. And what our experiences, as both researchers and students at HSIs, really, really helped us understand is that the needs, and I would say that a lot of the articles in that special issue, were really important in helping shed light on some of these things. Is that I think I lost my train of thought, but because I was thinking about one of the articles that I read in your special issue, where mestizaje was informing practitioners' ideas of, programming, for example, right? And we encountered that as researchers. We encountered that as students at HSIs, where people had this idea that they were doing a good thing, right? Because they're promoting, work and curriculum around Latinos, but then only focusing on one type of Latino, right? Or funneling
Chicanos. Chicanos is probably the article that I'm thinking of. Yeah, right. Like one type. Often.
One type, right?
Yeah.
And then negating the idea that some of us don't identify that way.
Yeah.
But being forced to socialize into a Latinidad that was what? Like, how many countries are there? I mean, not all of us speak Spanish either, right? So then this idea that, Latino Heritage Month has to have like a theme in Spanish. Okay, I get it. Like, most of us speak Spanish, but not all of us do. And especially those folks who come, who are coming to New York from Mexico. A lot of these people are not speaking Spanish. They have their own languages, right? That we still have yet to grapple with. But that I think K through 12 institutions are really trying to figure out as well, because they're starting to realize, maybe my curriculum shouldn't just be Spanish and English. That's not what these folks need. So what we were trying to offer was, bringing people to the table, who understood policies and practices around blanqueamiento, who got, ideas of mestizaje. It's not just any Latino, but folks who were experts in these areas to then help inform some of these practices and policies. We also, we typically in universities, and this being a higher ed scholar, but student leaders typically are picked over and over again. The same student leaders are picked over and over again to do the same kind of work, right? Which then leads to, the same kind of ideas, right? That and what happened to me when I was in college was I was literally tapped. I was not known in the university as, an activist. I was the kid who was in the cafeteria complaining with the rest of my peers about how racist the institution I was in was, but I wasn't a leader. Like I was literally tapped. And that's what we have to learn how to bring those folks to the table or go to them. Like what happened to me, like this administrator literally walked over to me and said, maybe this is what you need to be doing. I would never have done any of those things had somebody, had there been a little flyer on the wall that said, come do this X, Y, and Z thing. Come help us with that. I was like, no, that's whack. I'm not doing it. Right. So that's what we were hoping to do with in terms of implications and suggestions was, really at the end of the day, it's building community with people who you wouldn't typically build community with. Bringing, together scholars and practitioners who understand blancamiento, who understand mestizaje, who understand, who get the ideas of anti-Blackness, right, in their programming. How do we get those folks to help us think about these things in a different way? And, and also, really review our, really review the structural diversity of these institutions, but really think about, like, are my Black students dwindling? Right? Are we only getting one type of Latino, and why is that? Because those are going to be the folks who inform a new cadre of student leaders, right? If we're not noticing, we're supposed to be Hispanic serving institution, which means that we're not just supposed to be serving Latinos, right? We're a minority serving institution. We're supposed to be serving minoritized students, but we're neglecting our Black students, right? How are we reflecting on the numbers, right? Structural diversity is important, and we know that it's not enough, but it's important. And we need to stop calling populations diverse when one part of that diverse population is dwindling, or that they're not in leadership positions, right? Or that we're not offering them, support. And the other thing is we have to stop, we have to be real about there's perceptions that feel very real, but that are not very real. So one example is, perceptions that Latino students are doing great at Hispanic serving institutions because it's a racial harmony. And what we're saying is, that may not necessarily be true if you're not talking to, different types of Latinos, right? If you're talking to the same group of students, we're going to tell you the same type of thing, but not talking to the kid in the cafeteria, who's never in those, in those meetings. You might never know what exactly how that Hispanic serving institution is really serving them, right? So I think that it's important to really think critically about who we have, on that campus, really review admissions numbers, really think about what do we mean by diversity, right? There's a lot of diversity policies, but they don't necessarily address racial conflict, for example, right? We have a lot of diversity programming, but is that programming really helping us, talk about these conflicts openly and not be fearful of talking about conflict? For those of us who are critical students of critical race theory, we know racism is permanent. As a student of organizational conflict theory, conflict is permanent. These two things go hand in hand. So there's, we have to be comfortable with conflict and to have those conversations at HSIs about how are our Asian students doing? How are our Black students doing? How are Native American students doing? Do we have any Native American students?
Right.
And I'm talking about Native American students too, from Mexico and from Ecuador and from all, from Guatemala. Like, how are they doing? Because they may not think that they're Latino. They may want to find solace with us because they think that we're going to do right by them. And then when we don't, what's going to happen? Like I share that in the article, the ARA Open article, about the student who, described herself as Afro-Latina, but was not really welcomed by the Latino organizations. Right. And, so she, was more, she ran the Black student organization. She was nurtured and she was protected in the Black student organizations because the Latino organizations did not consider her Latina. They didn't reach out to her, right? So how are our Latino student organizations perpetuating understandings of Latinidad in our institutions is another way that we need to, that's like more practical, right? Like, what are the dominant ideologies that Latino student organizations are pushing in their programming, that are pushing, in their leadership? And how are we, instead of as practitioners sometimes, and I know this because I was a practitioner at one point, but we're like, students need to do it on their own. They can learn on their own. And that's not true, right? Every one of us needs support. My students teach me a lot. And my hope is that I teach my students a lot. And that's the way that I see student leadership, is that they need to figure out with us what this big Latinidad, process looks like. How are we either disrupting or maintaining it, and without critical knowledge of, ideologies like anti-Blackness, like, blancamiento, like mestizaje, we're running danger of maintaining a status quo that is a mestizaje 2.0, that we don't think is white supremacist, but is certainly anti-Black.
Right.
It's just called by a different name. It's just called Latino.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Oh, thank you for that. You are it's getting me to just think about so many different dimensions about even how the programming that we offer on campus, right? If it's from a monolithic approach, or the curriculum, or the support, or even who's represented in those Latino organizations, right? Like, all of that is serving this, and we think we're doing good, right? We're like, oh, look, we have all these Latino themes, and it's like, it's not Latino things, it's fill in the blank, one type of ethnic Latino, right? And I use Chicano as the example, right? Because a lot of our, early research, even my own research, that was the fill in the blank, right? Or Mexican American, right? And there's 20 other ethnicities within that larger umbrella, right? Latino umbrella, that, like, not necessarily, right?
This comes up on, in research. I've been asked to do in some discussions on and at conference presentations, where I've seen researchers call their paper stuff about Latinos, but then like 15 out of their 20 participants are Chicanos.
Right.
and I'm not using Chicano like that catch-all term, but they literally identify. And I'm just like, yo, how are you calling this paper about, how are you saying this is about Latinidad?
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like, I'm okay with you saying that, but you got to tell me why. And the people get mad at me all the time. They're like, well, because now I don't want to fuck shit up, but maybe I have to, because I certainly don't fit in your findings as an Ecuadorian American from New York, right? Like, you studied 15 Chicanos, 5 of them, one is Puerto Rican, one is Dominican, one is Ecuadorian, one is El Salvadorian, y la otra, I don't know from where, but then how do I'm not gonna relate to the Chicano, and I'm not saying that I can't, I'm just saying that our experiences are mad different. You know what I mean? And until, like, I remember in about 1997, right? I was sent to a conference as a student, and I forget, I think it was the Prop 209 that was being fought at the time.
Right, California.
And the students in California, I was like in awe of them, because they were telling us, it's coming to the East. Like, you guys are sitting comfortably now because it's not happening right now, but it's coming. And now we have this fight on affirmative action, right? And it's like, I didn't have that experience when I was in middle school. Like, even in college, like, we were fighting a different fight. We were fighting those microaggressions. We were fighting, the ideas of, faculty's lack of confidence in us. We were fighting institutional bias. We were fighting all of this, but we weren't fighting affirmative action, because it wasn't happening in the state of Massachusetts. It wasn't happening in the state of New York, right? And so those state policies were really critical to understand as a student leader, that I didn't have back then, but that I may have some context now, right? Um, state policies, are really important for when we talk about like as a practice, right? And how do we bring these ideologies to practice? But if we think about the ways that this country has really divided us, in those specific terms, like it wasn't like I didn't understand affirmative action. I knew what it was, but I didn't realize that that shit was coming home. I'm sorry to curse. I curse a lot.
It's all good.
But like I didn't realize that the fight was literally in California, right? Same thing with undocumented students now, which is some of the work that I began in 2006. But when you think about the ways that Hispanic serving institutions can support students, Latino students, particularly, places like New Jersey in 2018 passed state financial aid for undocumented students. Why aren't our HSIs pushing that?
Right.
Why aren't we elevating that? You know what that means? New Jersey loses over 50% of their students to other states for college, right? We have a whole bunch of students, undocumented or not, who could use this benefit. We're not advertising it. You know what that also means? Programs like EOP, EOF in New Jersey can now offer those students support. Why aren't we doing more work around that? It's not to say that they're not doing individually. It's just that as a state, we're not doing that, right? Is it because we don't know? Is it because we don't want those students? But why, as policy actors, HSIs not doing their due diligence to bring in those students now that we have the support? One of 7 states, New Jersey. New York doesn't even have state financial aid for undocumented students. So as a Hispanic serving institution, it is it's our job really to figure out what policies specifically serve Latinos, right? Undocumented students, the majority of undocumented students being Latinos, not all, but the majority, right? And how do we make sure that these students know that that service exists? How do we not do that in those states that offer that, right? And then in states like, I'm doing more research on states that ban undocumented students, and how folks there are supporting undocumented students. And what I found was that there is a lot of folks who are building scholarships to send undocumented students away. They can't even support their students in the state. Right. I don't know what Hispanic serving institutions exist in those states, but if they exist, they can't do much. So what do? Maybe partner up with the HSI in another state and see if we could get those students there. Why aren't we partnering with HSIs in other states that have more inclusive policies for undocumented students, to have more policies that could serve Latino students in particular ways? Higher education and student affairs professionals, we're the street bureaucrats. We're the ones who are implementing these policies, but we don't see ourselves as policy actors because no one's telling us that we are, until Blanca Vega tells them, of course. But but it's like we're not teaching our higher ed students, how, you're a policy actor. What's your job as a policy actor now, as a policy implementer? You work within the Hispanic serving institution. Now, how do we implement these policies that are not being pushed by the institution, right? That are kind of left quiet. It's just sitting there, looking pretty.
Yeah, right? For sure.
Looking pretty for the state.
It's like you answered all my questions. I didn't even ask them. You answered like all the questions I have for you, but it was beautiful because you did exactly what I was hoping, right? Which was just share so much knowledge with us. The policy piece is so important, right? And I knew you had done a lot of that work on with state level policy, and I think a lot about that is like, how does state level policy either help or hinder servingness. And you brought up something really important, is that half the time HSIs aren't even thinking about it, right? It's like, yo, this could really help your servingness, and you're not even thinking about it, right? I always think about the hindering, right? I'm like, what policies hinder us from serving? Yet you're right. There's policies that we could elevate our servingness, and it sounds like in New Jersey they're not even taking advantage of that, right? To say like, this could help us.
Right. Again, not saying that, I haven't done all the, I haven't gone to every institution, but there's no ad on it. I don't,
Right.
I don't see, listservs, on the joint. So it's like, but that I know that folks are on the ground, trying to get stuff done. My colleague, he's in the sociology department. We did a program in January, February, around the role of higher ed and undocumented students in New Jersey. And we brought in, a few experts to talk about the subject. And really, we wanted it to be intersectional, like there were scholars who spoke about the Black undocumented student experience. We need to know that. We spoke to student activists who were talking about like, how could we even focus, right? Another type of resource deprivation. How do we focus on our schoolwork when we have to think about how we're going to pay our tuition as undocumented folks, when we have to think about the messaging that Trump left behind about, the criminality of undocumented folks, when we have, higher ed leaders, who are writing these beautiful statements about support for undocumented students, but literally in the same letter, and I'm hoping it gets published because it's under review right now. But in the same statement, say we support border control. How do we do that, right? But then call ourselves an HSI, but then call ourselves, inclusive and open, and like I just, when we talk about like immigration, it's not a Latino face. It shouldn't be a Latino face, but you're going to encounter a Latino.
Yeah.
Right. So how are we training our leaders to really think critically about, themselves as policy actors, or at least our HSIs as policy actors, right? And if we're thinking about ourselves, if we really honoring the fact, that HSIs are policy actors within a racialized social system, then how are we then using that power to effectively allocate resources along the lines of race?
Absolutely. So all this stuff you're talking about, we are definitely going to drop in the show notes. You've mentioned so many of your articles, your teacher's college record. We already have note to drop that. The lessons from an administrative closure, the curious case of Black space at an MSI, which I read and loved in Frontiers in Education. I also love that you named the pseudonym was named after an Ecuadorian activist, right? And for the center, which is just great, right? Like that it's so authentic for you to bring your identity into all your research. So we'll drop that in. I just downloaded the Serving Black Communities at Hispanic Serving Institutions. Well, I had to request it from About Campus, and I always request it because I want you to get the downloads and whatnot. So you're doing great work, and we'll drop all that in the show notes so people can follow along with the really great work that you're doing, because you're definitely doing good stuff. But to finish, the final question, and for some reason, it's always the hardest question for people. I don't know why. You can go any which direction you want, but people come up because they tune into the show because they want to know what's going on, what's happening, ¿Qué pasa, HSIs? So with that, what would you say your final concluding thoughts on ¿Qué pasa, HSIs?
Ooh. I have to say that when I read the title of your podcast, I was immediately transported back to ¿Qué pasa, USA?
Yes.
Show.
Yes.
I'm sure that's where that you were inspired by it. And I remember that being one of the first shows in my childhood to really bring home that intergenerational Spanish, English, immigrants, non-immigrants, US born dynamics that could occur in a family, right? And when I think about your podcast and I think about like who you're inviting, right? And the fact that you were, that I was invited, because sometimes like I said, people get mad when I talk about these things.
I'm like, please come.
I'm not typically the favorite when it comes to these things, but that's what I think about that show. And I think I'm hoping that the podcast is the same thing, where you're not afraid to talk about conflict. You're not afraid. I really love how reading your stuff, like I know that you've grown in the work and thinking about these ideologies. And it can't be easy. And I think that, again, something that I saw in that show, and hopefully I'm gonna, witness in your podcast, but that I'm literally like bearing witness to your growth as a scholar, is that you're not afraid, to be confronted, by, what we know and what we don't know, and inviting people to say, what do you know that I can learn from? Right. And so I think in the spirit of the show, in the spirit of the old show, right, I think you're really bringing this to, to a community of folks who really need this nuanced understanding of Hispanic, Latino. I think we're in a lot of conversations I see on Twitter. I'm not as much on social media as I used to be, but these really, like, almost basic conversations, about who Latinos are, what we're doing, and then how these institutions like HSIs either maintain or disrupt that, is super important. And so I'm happy to hear and to know and to be part of now of this podcast, where my hope is that we can disrupt some of those ways that institutions like HSIs have traditionally maintained, but hopefully will now disrupt some of our white supremacist understandings of Latinidad.
That was the most affirming response I've gotten so far. So thank you for that. Thank you for the beautiful response and for the acknowledgement of the work. I absolutely am trying to complicate what we're thinking about and what we're learning. And I don't know a lot. There's a lot I don't know. So thank you for sharing your knowledge with us today and with me. And thank you for being on the show.
Oh, thank you for having me.